Okay, this begins the study of the book of Deuteronomy. That sounds like a mouthful.
Yes.
From the Old Testament. And this is one of those books that most people don't sit down and read unless they're reading the entire Bible. So I want to give some background on the book. And because this is not one that you read chapter by chapter, because it has 34 chapters. And that part of the Old Testament is very repetitious, and it has a lot of activity, and it has a lot of those hard names that people have problems trying to pronounce.
Yes, I recognize that.
Yeah, so I'm going to just give some background and some definitions. Deuteronomy is part of a 5-book set, so to speak. The first 5 books of the Bible reportedly was written by Moses. So, and so the people that put the Bible together grouped those 5 books, and that would be Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And they were, since they were all written by Moses, they were grouped together in a group called the Pentateuch. Now that's something you wouldn't be saying to people in conversation, but Penta means 5. So Pentateuch means 5 books. And people wonder, how would Moses know about creation? Because that's what's in Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve and how the world was created when no human being was there. It is believed that God spoke to Moses and gave him that information in one of the times that Moses went up to the mountain and stayed for several days. So that's how the creation story was written. And really, there are 2 kind of different creation stories, but the core of it is that God created everything from nothing. And that's the message that Moses was trying to get across to the people. The book of Genesis highlights Abram and Sarai. She was called Sarai before Sarah. And Abram, whose name became Abraham, is the father of 3 religions, of Judaism, Christianity, and the Muslim religion. All claim him as their founding father. And so Abraham in the story and Sarah in their old age had a son promised by God, because God said to Abraham that he would have ancestors as plentiful as the stars in the sky. So they had one son, and that was Isaac. And you might hear people say Abraham, Isaac, and then Isaac had one son, and that was Jacob. Throughout the story in Genesis, Jacob changed his name from Jacob to Israel. And that's how the country got its name, from their founding father, Jacob. Now, Jacob had 12 sons. they didn't count the daughters back then, they barely counted the women. So we don't know how many children he had, but it is recorded that he had 12 sons. And the different tribes of Israel are descendants from one of those 12 sons. And his youngest son was born through his wife, Rebecca. He had 3 wives at different times. And Rebecca was his favorite wife, and Joseph was his favorite son from Rebecca. And the brothers were jealous because they knew that Joseph's mother was the favorite wife and that Joseph was the favorite son. And Jacob had this coat made for Joseph that he didn't have made for any of the other brothers. So they were very jealous of him. And then he was bratty. He would run and tell the daddy what they did, like a young child would see something and run and squeal on the older siblings. So, and then Joseph had the ability to interpret dreams. So he told the other brothers that one day they would be bowing down to him. So they were really infuriated with him. And so they plotted to kill him. So they took him away from where they were. And they were going to kill him and leave his body there. But Reuben, who was one of the brothers, said, let's not kill him. Let's just leave him here in the desert to die. And we'll go back and tell our father, who was Jacob, that he was killed by some animals. And so they even arranged to have some blood to show the father that Joseph was no longer alive. Well, what I like about this story is, and we're in the Genesis, is that they meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. In other words, they wanted to destroy Joseph, but God meant for Joseph to go to Egypt. And Joseph got there to Egypt because they left, the brothers left him in a ditch or a trench, and some travelers saw him and they captured him and took him to Egypt. And so the brothers went back and told Jacob that he had been killed, and Jacob was just so distraught since that was his favorite son. Well, while Joseph was there in Egypt, he became one of the favorite prisoners, so to speak, there in Egypt, because he had the ability to interpret dreams. So he was able to interpret some dreams for the king. And one dream was that a big drought was coming. And so they should prepare for that drought. And so the king listened to Joseph, and they began to store grains away so that they could be prepared for this drought. Well, the drought really did come. And where the other brothers and the father were, a drought occurred there. So their daddy, Jacob, told the brothers to go to Egypt and see if they could get some grains so that the family would be able to survive. And so they didn't know that the king had moved Joseph up, and he was respected there in Egypt because of his ability to interpret dreams and because he saved Egypt from the drought, whereas the other surrounding countries were caught in it. So when they arrived in Egypt, they did not recognize Joseph. And so Joseph, however, recognized them. And he told them that he was the brother that they had left to die in the wilderness. And he said, instead of me giving you all grains, which would only last for a while, why don't y'all move here to Egypt? And you can share with all of the bounty that we have here. So Jacob, who became Israel, and the 12 brothers, well, the 11 brothers moved to Egypt, and they moved their whole families to Egypt. And that's how they landed in Egypt. And they stayed in Egypt for quite a while. And there was a Pharaoh who was intimidated by them. And his thing was, he said, those people multiply very fast. And if we don't control them, they're going to take over the Egyptians. Or if we are invaded, they're going to side with our enemies and hurt us. So the Pharaoh decided to make the Israelites slaves in Egypt. And that's how they became slaves. And they were in bondage for about 430 years. And that's a long time to be in slavery. And the Pharaoh was so frustrated because the more work he gave them, the more they did it. The more he increased their hardships, but they were still able to multiply and grow and have more children. Nothing could stop them. And so during this time, and this was several generations that they were there in Egypt, they prayed and prayed to God to help them, to rescue them. And you may have seen, especially around Easter, the story of the 10 Commandments. Well, Moses was sent by God to rescue the people, and Moses was one of them. But Moses has a side story about his mother sending him up the Nile in a basket, and he didn't know he was really a Hebrew because he was raised by the Pharaoh's daughter. So he thought he was one of them. But he, in a moment of anger, killed one of the Egyptians, and word got out that he had done that. So Moses left, and he left the Egyptian area. No, he left Midian, and he traveled in Midian and found a family that was not Jewish. And he married this lady who was a Moabite, and they had a son. But it was there that Moses saw on top of Mount Sinai the signal from God. He saw a bush burning, but it was not consumed. And when he went to the top of the mountain, God told him what he was going to do, and that Moses would be the one to deliver the people from Egypt. by that time, there were maybe close to 1 million of them. And Moses said, well, I can't talk. And so God said, well, in essence, that's no excuse. Your brother Aaron will go and be with you, and he will speak for you. So Moses brought them out of Egypt. And basically, I just moved from Genesis to Exodus, because Exodus is the story of them moving out of Egypt.
Mm.
However, once you leave Exodus, which is more like a narrative, and Genesis is a narrative, then you get into Leviticus and Numbers. And those two books talk about the laws that they have. And it does talk about them being disobedient to God any number of times. And one of the times that they were disobedient, God told Moses that they could not go into the promised land, that they would just be there in the wilderness wandering for 40 years. And the 40 years was enough time for the people that were grumbling to die off and a new generation to be born. However, Moses was still alive, and his brother and sister, Miriam, were still alive. And his brother and sister were able to go to the promised land, but Moses could not go because he made God angry. And his lesson was a lesson for us, because the people complained. And I'm sure he was disgusted, and he called them stiff-necked. God called them stiff-necked. And so they said, well, we have no water to drink. And they had said that several times, and each time God would provide some water for them. But this last time, Moses was so frustrated because his thinking was, if God had provided water all these other times, don't you think he'll provide it this time? And they were, whining and saying, you took us out of Egypt. We were better off being slaves, and you brought us here to die of thirst. So God told Moses where to go and told him to speak to this rock, and in speaking, saying in the name of God, so that they would know that the water that would come from the rock would be from God. But Moses was so angry that he just hit the rock, and water came out, and the people thought the water came from Moses. So that's how Moses got in trouble, and God did not allow him to go into the promised land. But now we get to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is a continuation of all of the story. And God had given Moses the tablets with the 10 Commandments. And when he came down from the mountain, it was kind of like our convention. You have 2 times to try to get it right. And the first time he came down from the mountain, he was so upset with them because they had taken their gold and silver and bronze and had a calf made out of it. And they made an altar and they start worshiping the calf. Well, people used to ask, well, if they were slaves, where did the gold and silver and bronze came from? Well, as they were leaving Egypt, the Egyptians were so glad that they were leaving that the Egyptians almost just threw stuff at them. Get on out, hurry, y'all hurry and leave. So they gave them all their gold, all their silver, and all their bronze. So these slaves or former slaves left rich. And so they had the all those things to make the calf, and they probably had many more things left over that they could use. And so Moses was so upset with them that he threw the tablets down, and they just broke into pieces. And of course, he had not explained the commandments to them, and that angered God. So God gave Moses a second chance. And so he went up to the mountain. This time he had a different kind of fellowship with God, and God wrote the commandments again and handed the tablets to Moses. And then Moses was able to give the commandments to the people. So when we get to Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy is really a book about those commandments. And it's a book telling us as readers that the people were about to cross over into the promised land. But Moses did a series of sermons which retold the story of their exodus from Egypt, retold the story of the commandments. And he told them that he would not be able to go to the promised land with them because he had sinned against God. Now, some people believe that Moses could not have written the last part of Deuteronomy because it talks about his death and how he died. So quite naturally, he could not have said, I died here. But that's what the book says, that he went up to another mountain and disappeared. Some theologians believe that in the transfiguration, that since Moses and Elijah were seen by Peter, James, and John, that God was merciful and allowed Moses to come into the promised land years after his death and to be there to welcome Jesus. Now, all this took place thousands of years, maybe 1,500 years before the time of Jesus. Because some people think it's all merged together. You go from one to the other. The Bible is divided into two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the Old Testament is really the story of the Hebrew people, which are the Jews. And they allude to Jesus coming, but they don't mention him. They talk about a Messiah, but they don't say that this Messiah is Jesus, because the Jews had been longing for thousands of years for the Messiah to come. And so when you get to the New Testament, that starts the story of Jesus with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that's, now Mark doesn't have a baby narrative, but Matthew and Luke have the baby stories, and John doesn't have the baby narrative like in a manger, but he talks about Jesus being born. And there are about 400 years between the last book in the Old Testament and the first book in the New Testament. So the last book is Malachi in the Old Testament, and the first book is Matthew in the New Testament. And so the New Testament is the story of Jesus. So, and then some churches only teach from the Old Testament. They're Old Testament churches, and they only read the King James Version of the Bible. Our denomination and most of the Catholics and the Lutherans are New Testament people. So that's the difference. Now, some of the churches that are Old Testament people will talk about Paul and the books that he wrote. And all of Paul's books are New Testament. Now, the entire Bible is a collection of writings put together. So it's not really a continuous story. So that's why I don't recommend that you pick it up and read it from Genesis to Revelation, because the books were written by different people. Moses happened to write 5 books, but Paul wrote a lot of different books as well. And some of the apostles wrote books. So these books met the criteria to be put into the Bible, but they're not one after the other. And that's where, we think a book is a book because that's the way our culture is. So that's why I wanted to bring you up to Deuteronomy. And it's hard to read Deuteronomy, starting with chapter 1 and going through chapter 34. So we're not going to do that. I think when we get into the details of Deuteronomy, we're going to start with chapter 4 and go from there. Because chapter 1 through 3 talks about their journey from Egypt to the wilderness where they were. So I just kind of summarized that. So do you have any questions so far?
No, but that was really interesting.
Okay, a lot of people don't know that that's the story.
Yeah.
Chapter 4. Now therefore hearken, O Israel.
Yeah, it was really, really interesting the way it flows
Yeah,
and who all and the people that are involved in it.
yeah.
How many years in between the New and Old Testament? I mean, it was all really interesting.
Yeah, since it's one book, you think, okay, it all happened in a year. But the story in the probably Deuteronomy was written about 1400 years before Jesus was born.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, and then the other books were probably written around that time as well. And one thing about the Israelites, the Jewish people, they're one of the few groups that recorded their history. I know in some of the African tribes, they have like a scribe or whatever, one person who can speak the history. But in the Jewish faith, they wrote their history down on scrolls. So when Jesus would be in the synagogue or the temple, he would pick up a scroll and read from the scroll. And a lot of the scrolls were discovered in contemporary times in 1948 in the desert, where
Wow.
some people thought the world was coming to an end, and they hid out in some caves, but they wrote down what had gone on prior to them getting in the caves, and those scrolls were discovered and translated.
Wow.
So that gave credence to what was already in scripture. So now I have what I'm getting ready to say now. I can give you a copy of this.
Okay.
You may have heard the term Torah.
Judgments which I teach you for to do them.
Torah.
Yes.
Okay. And I got this information from Jeffrey Krantz. I think he had the best information that I could find. So I'll go back over some of the things I said.
Okay.
The first 5 books of the Bible, and in order, would be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, form one unified group, which goes by several names. And you're likely to have heard them called the Torah. And that's what the Jews call it, the Torah. And that comes from the Hebrew word for law. Or you may have heard it called the Pentateuch, which comes from the, it means 5-book work, or the 5-fold book. And it's also been called the books of Moses. And Moses is credited with writing those books. And you wonder how, we didn't know how people wrote stuff down, but for things to be recorded, going back that far is a miracle. The Law of Moses is a blend of the first and third names. Each of these books have their own structure and story to tell. But right now, we're going to look into the work of the Torah. And what does Torah mean? And you might hear Torah in some of the New Testament scripture. The Hebrew word Torah means law or regulations. And if you're at all familiar with these books, that's almost all the explanation you need. This is where the prophet Moses introduces the people of Israel to the 10 Commandments, along with a host of other thou shalts and thou shalt nots. If you're reading the Bible in English, you won't find the word Torah used. Instead, you'll mostly just see the phrase, the law. But this isn't the kind of law that we're used to thinking of today that the Congress people make. When the writers of the Bible mention the law, they usually are referring to one or two things. One thing is partnership with God and Israel. Humans make modern laws, that's our laws, to maintain order in the society. But when the Torah was written, it was not about legislation or allegiance. The second book of the Torah, which is the story of their exodus from Egypt, tells the story of how God made a pact with the nation of Israel and himself. He would be their God and they would be his people. This type of pact was known in those days as a covenant.
Mhm.
Now, you may have heard, or you might want to notice when I do the Eucharist, I mentioned the new covenant. There's the Old Testament has older covenants, but we are new covenant people, and the new covenant is about Jesus. And when Jesus talks about the law, he explains it probably in a different way from the way the people thought it was in the Old Testament. A covenant, and I'll just make you a copy of this,
Okay.
is similar to a contract or a treaty. In ancient times, some kingdoms would become powerful enough to exert their authority beyond their own borders. These kings would come across smaller, lesser nations or city-states and strike up an allegiance with them. The lesser king, which would be called a vassal, would swear allegiance to the greater king, called the suzerain. The vassal would maintain their own national identity and a degree of autonomy, and would depend on the economic opportunities and military protection provided by the larger country. The mighty country or suzerain got tribute and taxes from the smaller one, not to mention the bragging rights of another kingdom under their authority. The specific terms of a covenant. These terms are decrees, the laws and regulations that the Lord established in Mount Sinai between himself and the Israelites. Israel, the Jews say that their nation is the only nation that has this agreement directly with God.
Mhm.
And if we want to latch on to this agreement or this communication through the new covenant, when we accept Jesus Christ, we become adopted children of the covenant.
Mhm.
And Paul says that we join that covenant through adoption. It took me a while to figure that out, adoption. But that's how we get into the covenant. The law can refer to the covenant in general, but you'll also find references to the law, to the laws written in the laws. So when I'm saying law within a law, for example, the commandments, the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots are laws within the laws. They're the ritual for observing feasts and offering sacrifices. I've never studied it, but the Israelites, the Jews, were required to observe several feasts.
Mhm.
There was one big one called what we call it nowadays, Yom Kippur,
Mhm.
where they confess their sins, the biggie. And there were other feasts that required them to travel, if they could, from wherever they were into Jerusalem, because the temple was in Jerusalem. where they lived didn't have a temple, it had a synagogue.
Mm.
And a lot of people think the synagogue and the temple are synonymous, but they're not. The temple was only in Jerusalem, and it was the place where the Ark of the Covenant was located. And the Ark of the Covenant was a box. It was a big, heavy box. And God told them while they were wandering in the wilderness how to make this ark. Now, why they call it Ark of the Covenant, I don't know, but that's what they called it. And God told them what to put in it. So in this ark was Aaron's staff, the manna, and the 10 Commandments.
Mm.
And whenever they moved from one spot to the other in the wilderness, the ark went first. And only the priests could touch the ark. It was just that holy. There's
Wow.
a story that this one man saw it about to fall, and he touched it to keep it from falling, and he died.
Wow.
And so if you read that story, you say, but he was trying to help, but only the priests. And the way God had this structured with the people of Israel, only one tribe of the 12 could have priests in their family.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so when they finally got to the promised land, they weren't given land. They were spread out among the 12 tribes. So each tribe could have a priest.
Mm.
And Aaron was the head priest or the high priest. And so the priest would carry the ark. But I was in a study and someone asked, well, that thing must have been heavy because it was made of gold and bronze and all this real richy stuff that was given to them when they left Egypt. And the study guide said the ark carried them. That when they got on each side, and was probably 3 or 4 priests on each side of the ark, when they lifted it up, their feet left the ground.
Mm.
And so because of what was in the ark and the holiness of it, and it was from God, and their feet didn't have to touch the ground, and it wasn't that heavy, that God was moving the ark for them. And the ark was the first thing to cross the Jordan River into the promised land.
Mm.
And one thing about them being in the desert, they saw images of God. During the day, there was a cloud over where the ark was. And at night, there was fire over where the ark was. And so they kept the ark in the temple. Now, when Israel, just a side story, was invaded, another country took the ark to preserve it so that Babylon could not have it. So we don't know where it is today.
Oh, wow.
So some people believe it's in Africa, that there's some guru or whatever in Africa that's preserving the ark. And some of the Africans were Jews. They called them Nubians, and they were part of the Jews that left Egypt.
Hmm.
So but that in itself is something you know you could talk about. Where is the ark?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now there are different kinds of covenants. There's a covenant of love and devotion for God. The Israelites couldn't worship any other deity, any other God. And because God's temple was in their midst, especially when they were wandering in the desert, the people maintained a degree of ritual purity. And then the covenant meant love and respect for other humans. Israelites were expected to show generosity towards marginalized people, execute justice for both the rich and the poor, and not bring shame on each other. The specific reasons why certain laws exist can be rebellious. Scholars have made all kinds of arguments for why the ancient laws believed pork and mixed fabrics were off limits. And if you got into Numbers and Leviticus, you would see that they were told not to eat pork and told not to use certain fabrics. It was very detailed. And those of us that are new covenant people don't follow that. But if you know about Muslims, they do not eat pork.
You know, Seventh-day Adventists don't eat it either.
Oh, really? Okay. And they got that from scripture.
Right, exactly.
They were told that they can't eat animals that have certain kinds of hoofs.
Yep.
And that might have been for their protection.
And they can't eat fish with scales. I mean, yeah. That the Seventh-day Adventists go by that.
Yeah, and they got that from the Pentateuch, from one of the 5 books. Yeah, so
Carrie, do the Jewish people only use the Torah? Do they only use the first 5 books of the Bible?
No, basically when they worship, they hear about the prophets, all of the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah. Basically, the Old Testament is theirs. Okay. So if you went to a Jewish service, it would stop there. There would be no communion because communion is about Jesus. So they would stop at what we call the peace, and that would be it. And they are still waiting for their Messiah.
Yeah.
And the New Testament was written to try to convince them that the Messiah has come, that Jesus is it. But they don't believe it. But the book of Revelation tells us that at the end of time, they will be given the opportunity to change their minds. Because I know some people are concerned, you know, what about people that never heard of Jesus, like the Hindus and the Buddhas and whoever. Now, the Muslims know Jesus existed, but they thought he was a prophet. So the Psalms are part of their worship because that's Old Testament. The historical books, that's Joshua and all the books, a few books after that, that kind of tell the history of Israel. just basically the Old Testament, I would say is part of the Torah. But this information specified just the first 5 books.
Yeah, I've heard mention of the Torah.
Yeah, yeah. And we don't talk about it that much.
Right.
Okay. Okay, there's a covenant. There's the old covenant and the new covenant, and we are new covenant people. The new covenant is with Jesus coming to save us. But what is a covenant? When the Bible mentions a covenant, it's referring to a strong, solemn agreement between 2 parties. However, biblical covenants are very different from the kinds of agreements that we make during these times. A covenant made between, when in the Bible, a covenant makes 2 people 1 person. It's just that bonding. When 2 parties make a covenant in the Bible, they are joined together and identified with each other. They may exchange coats, have a commemorative meal, and elect a long-lasting memorial to their promise. At every covenant's core, there is a change in relationship. In other words, usually you get better when you make a covenant. Covenants involve promises. One of the first covenants made in scripture in Genesis is the rainbow. And that's a visual covenant that God made, that the earth would not be destroyed by water ever again. People don't just join together at random when there's a covenant. The agreement usually includes some kind of practical application. Sometimes it means not harming one another, or sometimes it means protecting one another. Sometimes it means agreeing not to obliterate a weaker people group. In some cases, it can have everlasting consequences. So there are different covenants. Covenants involve families and bloodlines. In the Bible, 2 parties may make a covenant that is intended to last for generations. The following generations are automatically included in the covenant, and they share in the duties and benefits. For example, David made a covenant with his friend Jonathan, and that's not, they were good friends.
Right.
And scripture says they loved each other. Now people muddied that up. But after Jonathan died, he still cared for, David still cared for Jonathan's relatives.
Right.
Covenants are spiritually charged. When Jacob, who became Israel, and Laban agreed to keep the peace, they didn't just say, I'll do this and you'll do that. They called God as a witness, and that's in Genesis. When David and Jonathan called God as a witness to be with them, that was an example of a covenant. Covenants are taken seriously and for good reason. 2 people are joining together based on little more than their words. Their trust is divine, being held together by the accountability of each other. and covenants are not easily broken. People making covenants often slaughter animals to demonstrate what should happen to the one who breaks the covenant. To break a covenant is a serious thing. For example, Jonathan calls on God to kill him if he does not alert David of danger. When Saul breaks a covenant, his forefathers swear to the Gibeonites that God would punish Israel with a 3-year famine. When the Bible speaks of covenant, it usually means more than just an alliance, and certainly more than a transaction of goods and services. It is a bond that God himself holds people to. Now, one of the covenants in scripture was made between God and Abraham, when Jewish men could be identified by the circumcision. And there was disagreement when Paul came around, because he was sent to the Gentiles, and he ministered to them and started churches. And the churches that he started were not Jewish churches, they were Gentile or Christian churches. But the Jews said, because Paul was Jewish, but the other Jews said that if we have to be circumcised, these people have to be circumcised too. So Paul told them, no, they don't have to be. They're not part of that covenant that was between God and the Jewish men. But I remember when I was pregnant with my first child, my OB doctor referred me to a group of pediatricians that were all Jewish. And of course, they believed in circumcision, which, I went along with. I thought it was a good idea. And it was good to have Jewish doctors for my sons. Now, there were times when they treated me like a Jewish mother. Now, mama, the baby is not that sick. So now, Deuteronomy, finally, Israel, just across the Jordan River. And the Jordan is not a wide river. It's narrow. I thought it was going to be like the St. John's at wide points, but it's a narrow river. And the first part of Deuteronomy talks about spies that Moses sent from the Jews into the promised land to see how the people were, how big were they? Can we fight them off? A lot of people don't understand that the promised land was already inhabited by other people. So the Jews have been fighting for years, centuries, to have their own country. And I think it was in the 1940s that Israel finally was given to them, or made the country for the Jews.
Wow.
So that's a long time, because they were basically nomads. And because they were migrants, we're told that we should welcome migrants and not treat them like they're nothing, not treat them badly, because as Christians, we are migrants. Really, this is not our home. Heaven is our home. But, you know, especially in this country and maybe in some other countries where they have immigrants coming in, they get a bad rap. But the Jews they migrated for years. They didn't have a home. And so when they moved into the promised land, they had to capture the land from the all those names like the Zeits, the Hittites, and the Amorites, and all those other people that were already there. God told them how to defeat them. And basically, they either killed them off, or when they conquered the land, the people there were made slaves. And the Jews were, you know, people were almost afraid of the Jews because they knew that their God was a powerful God. And there's one contemporary story of the 7-day war where Israel should not have won the war, but they did. And I forgot who they were fighting. Okay, so in Deuteronomy, the Jews are just on the other side of the Jordan from the promised land of Canaan. Moses has led the young nation. All these are young people because the other ones that complained, they died off. And it was a young nation out of Egypt and on a 40-year journey through the wilderness. And they have just defeated several enemies before settling up camp here. 3 of the 12 tribes are already settled in the land east of the Jordan, and the whole nation is almost ready to enter the land God promised to their ancestor Abraham back in the book of Genesis. And God told each tribe where to set up camp. And then, you know, except the Levites, they were the priests. 40 years before they got into the promised land, God had rescued the Israelites from slavery in Egypt in the wilderness. The people agreed to form a special agreement or a covenant with their God, and that he would give them the land of Canaan and protect them as their God. And in return, they would keep his laws. However, and I like the people of Israel because they were so naughty. It's like bad children whining. Well, we should have stayed slaves. You brought us here for nothing. With God, however, the people of Israel violated God's laws almost as soon as he gave them. That generation fortified the promised land, which is in the book of Numbers. And now a new generation is about to make the journey into the land of Canaan. Before they do, Moses rallies the people, and that's what Deuteronomy is about, to remind them of God's laws and why they should obey him. This is how the book of Deuteronomy gets its name. And that name, which is strange, Deuteronomy, means God's law or second giving or second law. Deuteronomy reviews the Torah and foreshadows the rest of the Old Testament story. In Deuteronomy, Moses reminds the people of God's actions in the past. of God's promise to Abraham, which is in Genesis, his faithfulness in rescuing Israel in the Exodus, his holiness, which is in Leviticus, and his punishment if they're disobedient, which is in Numbers.
Mhm.
So that's why, I want to you can't just dive into Deuteronomy. It's at the end of these 5 books.
Mm.
Moses also gives directions, blessings, and warnings for the children of Israel in the future. He appoints Joshua as the new leader. He tells them about God's expectation of kings, which take effect when Saul becomes king. Now, the people, when they took the land, there were still people around them, other nations around them. And the people of Israel got jealous because God appointed their kings in the book of Judges. And they whined, well, we want to appoint our own king. So they used human values to appoint a king, such as they appointed Saul as their first king, done by the people, not by God. And they chose him because he was tall and good looking. But he ended up being so terrible. And God wanted David. So God anointed David, but David had to wait for Saul to get out the way before he could take over. Moses reminded them that they were God's people and they should be holy. And if they weren't good, they would be punished. And that's in Numbers. Moses also gives directions, blessings, and warnings for the children of Israel in the future. The appointment of Joshua, okay, I said that, is their new leader. God's expectations, and it starts with the book of Samuel. 1st and 2nd Samuel is about the different kings of Israel. And the prosperity for obeying God and what happens when you don't. And there's the story of David and Solomon. A lot of people want to know, where's David in the Bible? He's in the book of Samuel and in Kings. And Solomon's story is in Kings. You would think there'd be a book of Solomon, but Solomon did not write that book. He wrote other books. Let me see, Deuteronomy is primarily the retelling of the Mosaic law, but its text is still important today. When asked what is the greatest commandment, Jesus says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And this comes from the Old Testament book. And Mark refers back to Deuteronomy when he quotes this. Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 3 times. And I talked about that Sunday when the devil tempts him in the wilderness. Deuteronomy focuses on loving God and deepening, keeping his commandments, which is exactly what Christ expects of us. So I'll remind people Sunday, because it's almost 8:30. I'll remind people Sunday that we're in the book of Deuteronomy. And we're going to start with chapter 4. And we're
Okay.
going to be talking about chapters 4 through 10
Okay.
for the next lesson. And these chapters talk about Israel's relationship with God. And those chapters are not long.
This has been really interesting, Carrie. I've really enjoyed the background.
I think it's important that you do that. And that's the way, if we studied a book in seminary, we learned about who wrote it, why they wrote it, when they wrote it, who they wrote it to. All of that helps you to understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. I mean, because when you read, well, when I read the Bible, a lot of times I don't understand it. I make sure that I never do the King James Version.
Oh, yeah.
I quit doing that when Marcia, that's Marcia King, introduced us to the New International Version, the NIV. And when she did, I started using it. And that's all I ever use.
Yeah. Most of the churches nowadays that have Bibles in their pews use the NIV. Now, a few use the King James. I was in one of those King James churches, and I felt so sorry when the people would get up to read because you didn't understand those words. We don't say vouchsafe anymore and those kind of words.
Ronnie has been reading the Bible, but he's going through what you're saying, you know, one chapter following the other chapter following the other.
Yeah.
Chapter. And just like most people do when they read
A book.
Yes. So anyway, his sister is still very Seventh-day Adventist.
Oh, really? Okay.
They use the King James Version.
Oh.
And so he told her, you know, that he was reading the Bible, and she said, "Which one are you reading?" And so he told her the NIV. You know, yeah, and she sent him a King James Version.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she is very, very, very. You don't go to heaven unless you're Seventh-day Adventist. So,
yeah, I have some relatives that are Seventh-day Adventists, and we had a family reunion, and it was a grand mess.
I bet.
On Saturday, they went to worship.
Yeah.
And on Saturday, we went to Niagara Falls. And then on Sunday, we went to worship. And they went to the park to have a picnic. And,
wow.
and we traveled from Georgia because we met the family. That's where my father's family was headquartered, in Georgia. We gathered there in Georgia and drove up to New York. That's where the reunion was.
Wow.
And the only time we had something together was Sunday night when we had a banquet.
Wow.
Because they were worshiping on Saturday and we went to see Niagara Falls.
Wow. Well, I know, and you know, Ronnie was Seventh-day Adventist. Well, even when I first met him, he was. And they, you know, what is it, sundown on Friday?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, I think it's sundown on Saturday.
Yeah, that's their Sabbath.
Yeah, you don't do anything.
Right. And that's the old covenant.
Yes.
Yeah, and Jewish people and Muslim people and Seventh-day Adventists, and I'm not sure who else, they start their worship on Friday at sundown
Yeah.
and go through Saturday at sundown. But our scripture in the New Testament says early in the morning on the first day of the week, Jesus rose from the dead. And so our Sabbath is Sunday.
I wish I could get Ronnie to understand that. The one thing that he still holds on to is Sabbath is Saturday. And that's because of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it comes from there, and you can't change his mind. Do you know where that is in the Bible?
About early in the morning on it's in, I think, 2 or 3 of the Gospels. I have to give you specifics, but all 4 Gospels talk about the resurrection.
Okay.
And as Christians, since we believe that Jesus is the Messiah, we follow him. And the resurrection is proof that he is or was the Son of God.
Right.
So that's why we worship on Sunday, because our calendar, shows Sunday is the first day of the week and Saturday is the 7th day.
Right.
And so the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jews and the Muslims,
Yeah.
they shut down on Friday and Saturday. But I have to send you the exact scripture that says early in the morning when Jesus rose from the dead. And we adopted that as our Sabbath. Now, it doesn't say in the law that that's our Sabbath, because the law is from the Old Testament.
Right.
So, it could be 6 of this and half a dozen of the other.
Right.
So,
yeah, I know his sister thinks you're not going to go to heaven if you don't worship on Saturday. Okay. And I said, I'm sorry, I just don't believe that.
In Jerusalem on Friday evening, the only ones stirring around would be the Christians, because the Muslims and the Jews, they would be, observing their Sabbath.
Yeah.
And on Sunday, we would be observing our Sabbath, and they would be doing stuff. And, people used to say, because in Jacksonville for years, everything would shut down on Sunday.
Oh, yeah. I remember that.
Yeah, but they said when that was going on, find a Jewish restaurant and they'll be open on Sunday.
Yeah, because I remember, there were no restaurants, no grocery stores, nothing was open on Sunday.
Right, because that was our worship day. So now the commandment says worship God on the Sabbath, but it doesn't say 7th day of the week. I think it says Sabbath. And if you use the Gregorian calendar, that's a Saturday. And why they even started on Friday, I don't know. I have to look that up too.
Yeah.
I don't know. And a lot of people think that God wrote the King James Version of the Bible. But what happened was King James, whatever his number was, wanted scripture translated from Hebrew and Greek, because that's we had to study in seminary either Hebrew or Greek. And I took Greek so we could understand scripture as it was written, which was so different from just reading it.
Yeah.
And So King James asked for the scripture to be translated in English, but back then it was England's English. The these and the thous and the henceforth and all like that. That was the way they spoke when he ordered scripture to be translated. So some people think that God ordered it to be translated. And that's why they think King James is the only one.
And you know, when that was translated, you still had someone translating it, just like the new the NIV. You know, you had someone translating from King James into NIV. Same way when you're translating from another language into King James. So, I mean, I see no difference really, except that I can understand it.
I think to me, that's the most important part, that you understand it.
Yeah.
And when I'm preparing a sermon, if there's something I really just can't figure out, I'll get Eugene Peterson's book, his Bible, and his is written very contemporary. You could understand it. It's called The Message. And I like that because it uses today's language to explain scripture.
That's one reason I like to use the Bible app.
Okay.
You can change it into any version.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll do a couple of them just so I can make a comparison.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I found in seminary, even at that, Hebrew is such a deep language that some things are so hard to interpret. We don't have an equivalent in our language. So that's why they want students to study the Bible in Hebrew.
Wow.
Or study it in Greek. So, you know, I have a deeper understanding of what was going on if I look at the Greek message versus the English message. Yeah, well, Norma, I appreciate, I know this will be recorded for others, and I hope the others do join in, because Deuteronomy is something we don't ever talk about.
No. Now I noticed that in the forward, the forward day, what is it, day by day?
Yeah.
I noticed that they have been referring to it this month, to Deuteronomy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't read it today, but
I read it yesterday. I was going to read it today, and it's been really busy, so I didn't get a chance to yet. But yeah, there was one Bible reading that they had referred to yesterday, and I actually think there was one the day before as well.
Okay. Okay, yeah, but I think that background is helpful.
Oh, absolutely. It's really, and to me, it's just really interesting.
It is. It helps you to understand things and understand why groups do what they do.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, because I know I was teasing Sylvia, said, you know, you can take a person out of the Baptist church, but you can't take the Baptist out of the person. And she said she didn't like all that standing, sitting, and kneeling that we do. Now, scripture doesn't say that, but the Israelites, when they were wandering in the desert, they did the standing and the kneeling. So, yeah. And, you know, like when I'm getting ready to do communion, I put on a chasuble. Well, they did that in the wilderness, and God told them how the priest should dress.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah. I did a study of them wandering in the wilderness, and that helped me to understand that we got that from the Old Testament. In other
Wow.
words, God wanted the priests to come before him dressed up, and they had different colors, just like we have different colors.
Oh, wow.
And God gave talent to the people to make the outfits for the clergy to wear.
Wow.
That's right. And because I was wondering how they know how to sew, and what did they have to sew? Well, they did it by hand, but they had the material. They got it from God. It was
Wow.
just fascinating. And
Wow.
they had, for their altars, they had the same colors that we have: the red, the purple, the green, and the white.
Huh.
But you go to a Baptist church, you don't see those colors.
Uh-uh.
Yeah, and Lent is not in the Bible.
Right.
So we use that as a method for us once a year to examine ourselves.
Yes.
So yeah.
Lent is one of my favorite times.
Oh,
during the year.
it's okay.
I love it.
Yeah, it's something that the Catholics and Lutherans and Presbyterians and
Yeah.
some United Methodists do once a year for 6 weeks to make themselves ready for resurrection.
You know, actually 1122 even does it.
Oh, okay. I'm
Yeah.
surprised.
Yeah, I was too, but some of my friends that go there were telling me about it.
Oh, okay. But that's something that's not in scripture. That's more contemporary.
Yeah.
But anyway, Norma, I'm glad you got something out of it, that
Absolutely.
you learned something.
I learned a lot.
Okay. Well, I'll make some copies of this, and if anybody wants some, they could get the copies.
Okay.
And we will start with chapter 4 and go through chapter 10 next.
Okay.